Continue our series of Orchos Chaim Rosh. Kol Yerches, Al Tiftach Bal Shrecha. Do not trust your riches. Kebaltech Bashom Lakeit Sonim. It's not because it's a Vashmeni Yeshua and Vayivat, or because Al Tiftach Medivim Ve'adam Sheis Yeshua, or Shemant Avisa Kasisa V'Tishkach Kemachol Leka, because Kol Chibot Zmiel Yosil Yeschaim Azeh, but rather Kebaltech Bashom Lakeit Sonim, because Shel Tachasonov. Somebody trusts their riches, then they will gather enemies and will stumble beneath their enemies. In other words, a person who trusts riches becomes brazen, becomes arrogant, becomes self-complacent, and becomes smug, and becomes intolerable. Becomes somebody who people find to be abhorrent, find to be repugnant, find to be difficult, find to be detestable. So therefore, says the Rosh, don't trust your riches, because your riches will not just lead you away from Kodesh Baruch Hu, but they'll lead you to make enemies. Which is a very powerful statement, because even a person thinks that they're being frum on, if they're making enemies through them, then there's something being wrong and they're backfiring and they're not doing you any good, they're only doing you harm. If people, even though a person is supposed to be Masarev at first, even twice, not to answer a call, when a call for Aliyah or Kibbutz, but nevertheless, a person is becoming a person to serve the people of a city and to be Nosei Ba'ol with Chavei Rav, certainly with the people with whom he is living, and therefore it's while it's appropriate to be Masarev L'Gdula, but nevertheless, one is supposed to eventually, in relatively short order, give in, because especially if it's important and imperative. And of course, we know Amos Arvin Logodo, that if somebody great asks you to actually do something, and it's important and positive and beneficial, so even though your anova might be such that it would cause you to actually try to avoid it, nevertheless, this too is a form of anova, meaning that if other people need you, want you, have a role for you to play, then to accept that, even though it might go against your grain, even though it might be something which you might think is against anova. In fact, the anova is to accept that there's a tzorchei rabim involved, and that there is an avodah involved, which is ultimately going to be a kiddush Hashem if you do it correctly. So therefore, you should always be prepared to accept a burden of public service upon your shoulders. It's not the same thing as Snows or Rabbanus. You're supposed to hate Rabbanus because Rabbanus is like, well, you're a rebone, you are a master. But this is not the case. It's like the Chasam Sofer says that a famous Chasam Sofer that is Mesupik if a Rav can sign a contract for 6 years because Kili B'nei Savadim Lo Avadim Lo Avadim, and a Rav is an Eved, and he signs a contract for 6 years, he's like accepting Avdus on himself. I think Chasam Sofer seems like he has 3-year contracts, I forget if that's the case. But in any event, yes, there's a difference between the Rabbanus of being reborn on others, which is a very rare phenomenon nowadays, and the Rabbanus of serving others, Avodas HaKodesh, and that is what the Rosh is saying. Do not accustom yourself to eat much outside your house with lots of people. If not a Suas Mitzvah, of course, the Talmid Chacham is not supposed to eat in every place, supposed to know with whom he's sitting. The Kiyadash Yerushalayim would always make sure to know who's there back with them. But it makes a person cheaper and coarser to constantly be eating in outside Shalom Makom Mitzvah in large gatherings with large amounts of people. And in general, the idea is that a person's material pursuits of all kinds are supposed to be done about Snei Leches, supposed to be done in a modest way, in a humble way, in a private way if possible. It's not just things which we talk about normally about priestess and sneas, such as things which have to do with Ben Ish Ishto and things like that, but rather any type of taiva, any type of desire, any type of physical activity is something which is supposed to be not the basis of one's commonality with others. One's commonality with others, which should be commonality with others, should be Torah and Maisim Tovim, and a person should distance himself from large gatherings which are not focused on a mitzvah. Do not accustom yourself to get drunk from wine. It says Al Targil, we're just coming off of Purim, and Purim is not Rogil, but there's a once a year But again, getting drunk debases oneself. And even if a person is born a time chacham, who when they get drunk, they start speaking words of Torah and singing zmiros with shishpachos, nevertheless, it's not something which should be done except on rare occasion. Pentiem megunad, because it's going to be degrading. Utznabas picha, and you can never tell when you're going to say the wrong thing when you're drunk. Of course, as Hashem is baruch, a person who's retired themselves and mekadosh themselves will be more nishmar intrinsically, but you never can tell me to say the wrong thing and have to regret that afterwards. And this is something which happens, unfortunately, when a person's inhibitions are loosened. Sometimes those barriers are good to remove, but most of the time those barriers are there for a reason. The reason is to make sure not to say or do the wrong thing. Kufcha beis al tichas be'ishtecha. Don't get angry at your wife. Imrachakta osa b'smol karev osa b'yamin below ichur. And if you pushed away with the left, bring her close with the right without any delay. In other words, obviously back then there was more an idea of a husband being and there being a certain type of spiritual leadership incumbent on the husband, which is less necessary and less manifest nowadays. But even if such a spiritual leadership is necessary occasionally, nevertheless, of course, it should be done with small dochim, meaning karevis, which, if you're lefty, it's the other way around, but it's the same idea. In other words, your strong hand should be the one which is makarev, and your weaker hand should be the one which is merachik, and especially because anger is the eish. Lo zachu ish then eish ochlam. Anger is the eish, and a person who gets angry in his house, even though he can feel is justified, nevertheless, it's not. The idea of shalom bayis is even if you feel you're justified, you feel you're right. So, nevertheless, a person is supposed to be a vatran. I had a dream the other night, a few weeks ago, and I told my wife, where I had a dream that I knew I was wrong about something. Yet, nevertheless, because I knew I was wrong, I was putting on a false front and trying to argue my point with her and carry the day. So, of course, she said that's typical. But that is very often the case. You know you're wrong, and you get angry anyway because your self-esteem or your self-image is involved, and ultimately, there's almost nothing in this world worth getting angry about. And really, it's a trend, especially for those who are redheads, to try and avoid such anger. But the Orchos Chaim is saying, especially in a place where you want Shechina Shriya B'neihem, anger is the worst possible enemy of that Shechina. Kufchav Gimel, Ba'al Tvazes Ishtecha, V'kabedo Sab Sirena Minachet. So don't embarrass your wife. The two ways which you can embarrass your wife: to embarrass directly by making insulting comments, but embarrass indirectly by not being the public public face of the family. My wife always used to tell me when she used to try to get me to do the right thing, and perhaps she would still tell me, but perhaps she's given up, that the husband is the public face of the family, whether we like it or not, and therefore you have to make sure not to be mevazeh your wife, not just directly, but also indirectly, by not doing things which will degrade the family, which will degrade her as a result. And of course, the kavod also works both ways, by direct respect and by saying nice things and mention one's wife and being able to give their understanding to the world that one's wife is a gavra, a isha chashuva. And of course, the Srei Mechet can be taken here again in two ways. One is direct, remove her from sin, but more likely nowadays, when wives are very often more educated in other things other than Gemara than their husbands, it means that you should make sure not to cause her to sin by you making sure to do the right thing, and therefore she not emulating you doing the wrong thing or being upset with you, and therefore, so to speak, sinning and rebuking you. But in any event, again, all of these things are much more indirect than direct. Back then, when women are less educated, it's much more direct. Today, it's much more indirect. Do not cause her bizayon. Make sure that the respect for your wife gets across, especially to your children. That's very, very important. And through that way, there will be a distance from sin. Kuf Dalit. Alti Rogile Shape Im Halitzim Chusei Nefesh Penyach Yucha. Do not be accustomed to sit with scoffers who have lower souls, who have diminished souls, because they might cause you to sin. So people who scoff had the Orchos Tzadikim I learned today that the idea of anova is a good thing almost always, except you should not be anova when it comes to rejecting leitzim, because leitzim are the ones who are in themselves have diminished souls because they do not have the proper values of respect towards things which deserve respect. They tear things down instead of building things up, and of course they can have a negative influence on you. So do not sit with those leitzim, because they will cause you to become late as well. And the converse of that is kufchaf hey. Do not be lazy to quest wisdom. And part of questing wisdom is to give mussar to your friend, but in secret and in a respectable way. In other words, the quest for chachma, A, should be for chachma to give mussar properly. B, the quest for chachma should be something which causes you to understand that your friend, who's perhaps not on the same level, has to be tolerated and given mussar in a positive way, not in a negative way. And this interesting language here, alti tatzel b'keish chachma. The indication is that, like Chazal say, that heavy lami kol adam, chachma is all around. You don't have to go so far to look for chachma. Just don't be lazy. Wherever you go, you can find chachma. Like Chazal say, chachma goy tamin, but chachma comes anywhere. So therefore, don't be lazy levakesh chachma. If you're not lazy, chachma, ma'ayin timatzei, comes from nothingness. Chachma comes from anywhere. You can find chachma. It's chachma is yesh me'ayin. Can come from anything and anywhere, anytime. So therefore, you have to just not be atzel levakesh chachma. And you should always help other people to find chachma as well. Again, in their covered, not and in safe there, not by the counterproductive way of embarrassing them and doing it in a degrading way.